Near zero visibility. That is the phrase investigators used to describe the final minutes before 3 wildland firefighters died on a hillside outside Grand Junction, Colorado. On June 27, 2026, a 5-person helitack crew was sent to knock down a small, fast-moving fire near the Colorado-Utah border, southwest of a town called Loma in Mesa County. Within hours, that small fire had a name, the Knowles Fire. And within hours after that, it had merged with 2 other fires burning nearby, the Snyder Fire and the Gore Fire, swelling past 30,000 acres. The crew never saw it coming the way it came. According to a preliminary federal report described by the Colorado Springs Gazette, heavy smoke created conditions so thick that a helicopter could not lift the crew out before the flames reached them. With their escape routes cut off, the 5 firefighters did the only thing left to do. They deployed emergency fire shelters, thin, foil-lined tents that are, by design, a wildland firefighter's very last option, used only when every other plan has failed. 3 of them did not survive the burnover. A 4th died of his injuries weeks later. This is where the story starts, but it is not really where the story begins. To understand why a 5-person crew ended up trapped on a ridge in western Colorado, you have to understand what has been quietly changing underneath America's entire wildfire season for the better part of 2 decades, and why the people whose job it is to stand between that fire and the rest of us are increasingly the ones paying for it. The 4 firefighters who died were identified by the U.S. Department of the Interior. Emily Barker was 38 from Clinton Township, Michigan, assigned to the U.S. Forest Service's Rifle Helitack Crew, based out of Rifle, Colorado, not far from Grand Junction. Nick Hutcherson was 27 from Glendale, Arizona, normally assigned to the Kaibab National Forest. Sidney Watson was 27 from Warrior, Alabama, working under the U.S. Wildland Fire Service's Rifle Helitack Unit. All 3 died at the scene on June 27th. The 4th member of that crew, Nathan Matthews, 43, of Lincoln, Nebraska, was pulled out with severe burn injuries and treated for weeks before he died on July 24th, nearly a month after the burnover itself. A 5th firefighter survived and was still recovering as of the most recent reporting. The Rifle Interagency Helitack Crew, based in Rifle, Colorado, roughly 40 miles east of Grand Junction, is one of the specialized aerial response units federal agencies rely on precisely because they can be flown into remote, fast-developing fires faster than ground crews could ever hike in. A capability built for speed that, on June 27th, could not outrun the smoke fast enough to matter. U.S. Wildland Fire Service Chief Brian Fennessy called it, in his own words, another heartbreaking loss for the wildland fire family. Colorado Governor Jared Polis said in a statement that the bravery of that crew was part of the reason so many homes and communities across the state had been protected this fire season. Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs said Hutcherson embodied the courage that defines wildland fire crews. And Colorado Senator John Hickenlooper publicly called for what he described as a swift and thorough investigation, saying officials needed to understand exactly what went wrong so it does not happen again. That investigation, led by a federal serious accident investigation team, is still ongoing. The preliminary report released so far is explicit that its findings are not final. Investigators say the synopsis represents only verified preliminary facts, and that a complete report will follow. So some of what happened in those final minutes near Grand Junction remains, as of now, unresolved. What is confirmed is this: the crew was conducting initial attack, the earliest and often riskiest phase of a wildland fire response, when lightning ignited a new fire nearby. Conditions deteriorated fast, and the smoke that built up around them became so dense that the helicopter that might have pulled them to safety could not get in. Burnovers like this one are mercifully rare. But wildland firefighting as a profession has never been more dangerous, and the data increasingly backs that up. According to CNN's reporting on the Knowles Fire tragedy, wildland firefighter deaths, as a share of all firefighting fatalities in the United States, have risen from roughly 2% to roughly 10% over the past decade, even as wildfires themselves, according to research CNN cited from the American Burn Association, have become somewhat less frequent overall. Read that again, because it is the strange, uncomfortable core of this story. Fewer fires, but a growing share of firefighter deaths happening on wildland fire lines rather than in structure fires. Rick Miner, an advocate who has spent 30 years working on behalf of wildland firefighters, told CNN that in his 3 decades in the field, he has watched the character of fire itself change. In his words, what used to be a wildfire deep in the mountains is now something else entirely. Faster, more erratic, and increasingly showing up in places and at times of year nobody used to plan for. That is the thread connecting the tragedy in Mesa County to a much bigger and much older pattern. For decades, wildfire in the American West followed something close to a predictable calendar. Snow melted in spring, vegetation dried out through summer, and by late summer into fall, conditions were primed for fire, peaking historically in August, when heat and dryness are at their worst. That calendar is breaking down. According to a widely cited 2015 study published in Nature Communications, fire weather seasons have lengthened across more than 18% of the world's vegetated land surface since 1979, and areas experiencing unusually long fire seasons have more than doubled globally. A newer 2026 study published in Geophysical Research Letters, focused specifically on North America, describes what its authors call the erosion of the traditional seasonal constraints on wildfire, meaning fires are no longer confined neatly to summer and fall, but are increasingly showing up in what used to be considered the off-season. That same study points directly to the Los Angeles wildfires of January 2025 as a case study, noting that those fires were extreme not just in scale, but in timing, striking well outside what anyone would have called fire season a generation ago. Officials at California's state fire agency, CAL FIRE, have themselves said publicly, according to reporting from the Union of Concerned Scientists, that there effectively isn't a wildfire season in California anymore, that the state is now fighting fire essentially year-round. If you want a concrete recent example of exactly what that shift looks like when it hits a major American city, you do not have to look far back. On January 7th, 2025, a wildfire ignited in the Santa Monica Mountains of Los Angeles County and grew, within hours, into the Palisades Fire, one of the most destructive urban interface fires in American history. According to Wikipedia's tracking of the incident alongside coverage from Fox Weather and the Los Angeles Fire Department, the Palisades Fire ultimately burned nearly 2,500 acres over 25 days, before full containment on January 31st, destroying more than 6,800 structures and causing roughly $25 billion in damage. 12 people died in that fire alone. Just hours after the Palisades Fire started, a second blaze ignited near Altadena in the same county, the Eaton Fire, which went on to destroy more than 9,400 structures and, according to Britannica's accounting, caused 18 more deaths, bringing the combined toll from the two fires into the 30s. Firefighters were not spared. LAFD confirmed that a 25-year-old firefighter suffered what officials described as a serious head injury while battling the Palisades Fire, was treated at the scene, and was transported to a hospital for further evaluation. Fox Weather reported that 9 firefighters in total were injured across the two fires, as crews worked around the clock, at one point straining the water pressure in local fire hydrants because of the sheer volume being used to fight the flames. Los Angeles City Fire Chief Kristen Crowley told CBS Los Angeles that even as firefighting efforts were showing success, extreme fire danger remained across the region. The National Weather Service, at the time, was warning that the same Santa Ana winds that had turned the fires into infernos could return at any moment. And Los Angeles, notably, had gone more than 8 months without significant rainfall heading into what should have been the rainy season. That is the year-round fire season, made visible in one of the largest cities in the country, so the fires themselves are changing, burning longer, starting earlier, and showing up in seasons and locations that used to be considered safe. But there is a second, less visible half of this story, and it is about the people sent to stand in front of those fires. For years, investigative reporting, including a widely read 2025 ProPublica investigation, has documented what amounts to a slow-motion staffing collapse inside America's wildland firefighting workforce. Before a 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law, most federal wildland firefighters earned less than $15 an hour, genuinely less, in many cases, than retail or fast food work paying in the same town. That infrastructure law authorized roughly $600 million to raise wages, but for years, the raise itself existed in a kind of legislative limbo, repeatedly threatened with expiration unless Congress acted to extend it. In November 2023, Congressman Josh Harder of California warned publicly that firefighters were only days away from losing up to $20,000 a year in pay, along with new physical and mental health benefits, and he said, at the time, that as many as half of all wildland firefighters nationally were prepared to resign if Congress didn't act. It took until March 2025 for that pay increase to finally become permanent, locked in through a continuing resolution that established a new base salary structure and a premium pay category specifically for hours firefighters spend mobilized on an actual incident. But permanent pay reform came bundled with painful cuts elsewhere. According to reporting from News Nation, roughly 3,400 workers were cut from the U.S. Forest Service during a federal downsizing effort, alongside about 1,000 cuts at the National Park Service and another 1,000 at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. A former Forest Service employee told reporters that the agency had been left scrambling to keep frontline firefighters available after losing so many people earlier in the year. So much so that the agency took the unusual step of waiving a federal cap, limiting how many hours temporary seasonal firefighters could work, allowing them to work up to 1,560 hours instead of the standard 1,339-hour limit. The U.S. Forest Service's own workforce data, published on its website, shows the agency set a 2026 hiring goal of 11,300 wildland firefighters and says it exceeded that target, reporting 11,816 wildland firefighters on board as of July 6, 2026, 104% of goal, and reached earlier in the year than at any point since 2022. And yet, in the same breath, the agency itself acknowledged, according to government executives reporting, that even a fully staffed workforce isn't enough capacity to meet the needs of what it calls the continuing wildfire crisis. That is not a critic's assessment. That is the federal government's own words about its own workforce. A June 2026 survey conducted jointly by the nonprofit group Grassroots Wildland Firefighters and the National Federation of Federal Employees, reported by Federal News Network, found rising burnout and low morale across the federal wildland firefighting workforce, even as the raw hiring numbers looked healthier on paper. Reva Duncan, a retired 30-year Forest Service fire staff officer who now serves as Executive Secretary of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters, has pointed out that even when frontline firefighter positions are protected from cuts, the support roles around them, logistics, finance, dispatch, are not always protected, and losing those roles still ripples out and lands on the people actually standing on the fire line. In her words, there's a massive machine working behind the scenes that most of the public never sees, and when parts of that machine are stripped away, the frontline workforce absorbs the strain. Meanwhile, at the local and volunteer level, the picture is arguably worse. A report cited by NewsNation found California alone is roughly 1,250 wildland firefighters short of full staffing on its crews. In Monroe, Louisiana, one local fire department told reporters it is down 25 firefighters and has resorted to one-on-one recruiting at career fairs just to fill trucks. New York State Senator Steve Rhodes told reporters plainly that the volunteers who would have staffed rural departments a generation ago simply don't have the spare time anymore. Many are working 2 jobs, living farther from the districts they'd serve and facing training requirements that can run into hundreds of hours before they're even certified to respond to a call. Pay and staffing are only part of what firefighters are absorbing. The other part is what the job does to their bodies and their minds over years of exposure, and here too, the research is becoming harder to ignore. A 2025 study published in the International Journal of Wildland Fire, surveying more than 2,600 wildland firefighters, found rates of post-traumatic stress disorder at roughly 13, 7% depression at 17, 3% generalized anxiety at 12, 8%, and past year's suicidal ideation at just over 20%, with researchers noting that across nearly every measured condition, rates ran 2 to 10 times higher than in the general population. A separate national survey of firefighters broadly, cited in a report from Psychiatric News, found that 55% of firefighters reported a history of suicidal behavior at some point in their careers, compared with 32% of people working outside the Wildland Fire Service. Researchers writing in the same International Journal of Wildland Fire study noted that current clinical standards for diagnosing post-traumatic stress were largely developed by studying civilian populations, and cautioned that those standards may not fully capture how trauma shows up differently in wildland firefighters, who tend to face repeated, cumulative exposure over an entire season rather than a single traumatic event. A 2024 survey of wildland fire dispatchers, the people coordinating crews by radio rather than fighting fire directly, found that 94% had experienced some form of work-related trauma, that 57% had dispatched resources to an incident that ended in a death, and that 59% said they had personally known a wildland firefighter who died by suicide. Of more than 400 dispatchers screened for suicide risk in that same study, published in the journal Fire, 32% showed some level of risk, and nearly a third of those said their job had made their own suicidal thoughts worse. Pete Dutchick, a former hotshot crew member interviewed by Mountain Journal, said he lost 3 friends to suicide within 5 years, and watched others die of cancer in their 30s and 40s, well before what most people would consider old age. Reva Duncan, testifying before the House Natural Resources Committee, described a workforce she said is at its breaking point. Her words, pointing to a wake of mental health issues, suicides, high divorce rates, and deeply concerning levels of cancer and cardiovascular disease tied to years of undocumented exposure to smoke and particulate matter on the job. Researchers have also documented a physical toll that goes beyond the immediate risk of burnover or entrapment. Studies cited by Mountain Journal and Inside Climate News have linked wildland firefighting to elevated rates of various cancers, driven both by wildfire smoke itself and by the chemicals used to fight fires, including flame retardants. Patricia O'Brien, an Oregon psychologist who spent 15 years working as a wildland firefighter herself, has said researchers still don't have hard numbers on completed suicides in this specific workforce, a genuine, acknowledged gap in the data, and one worth being upfront about here, rather than filling in with a number that doesn't actually exist yet. Now overlay the fatality numbers themselves because they tell their own version of this story. According to the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center's year-end tally, the United States lost 11 wildland and structural firefighters combined to line-of-duty deaths in 2024, the fewest since 2019 when the total was 9. That 2024 total included firefighters from federal, state, and local agencies, as well as 3 air tanker pilots killed in 3 separate aviation accidents. Notably, one of those 2024 deaths was categorized differently than most. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service classified a fatality caused by occupational cancer as a line-of-duty death, a recognition that the danger of this job doesn't end when the fire does and can show up years later as a diagnosis rather than a burn. Historically, researchers note there is no clean, steady trend line in wildland firefighter deaths from year to year. The numbers spike and dip based on how any given fire season behaves. In 2013, 31 firefighters died fighting wildfires nationally, a year that included the Yarnell Hill Fire in Arizona, where 19 members of the Granite Mountain Hotshots were killed after being overtaken by rapidly shifting flames, still one of the deadliest wildland fire incidents in modern American history. The following year, 2014, that number fell to 11. It is exactly that volatility, a profession where safety can look fine for a stretch and then collapse catastrophically in a single afternoon, that makes incidents like the one outside Grand Junction so difficult to predict, and for the people who do this work, so difficult to fully guard against. The broader 2026 numbers add more context. According to Wikipedia's ongoing tracking of United States wildfires, sourced to the National Interagency Fire Center, the country recorded 29,023 wildfires, burning a combined 2,340,604 acres through the year, as of the most recent tallies, following a start to the year that was already unusually active, nearly 1. 85 million acres burned in the first 4 months of 2026 alone, well before the traditional peak of the season had even arrived. The same tracking notes that firefighting efforts in 2026 required what it describes as record mobilization of personnel and resources, with incident management teams, ground crews, and aerial assets extensively deployed across numerous large, complex fires, while prescribed burning and mechanical fuel reduction work. The preventative measures that reduce future fire risk faced narrow windows of safe weather and ongoing drought that limited how much of that mitigation work could actually get done. In neighboring Canada, whose wildfire smoke regularly drifts across the U.S. border and affects American air quality, 2026 has also been an active year, with more than 1,495 fires recorded by the end of May, and at least one Canadian firefighter, a 40-year-old battling a blaze near Michelle in Nova Scotia's Annapolis County, dying from a sudden medical emergency while on duty, a reminder that the physical strain of this work can kill firefighters even without a single flame reaching them directly. That Canadian season also saw evacuation alerts issued for communities like Conklin, Alberta, and repeated flare-ups across the Athabasca oil sands region, underscoring that this is not a uniquely American pattern. It is a shift playing out across an entire continent's fire-prone geography at once, from the Pacific Northwest, down through the Rockies, and up into the Canadian boreal forest. Zoom out even further to the global picture researchers have been tracking for more than a decade, and the trend holds. The 2015 Nature Communications study that first quantified lengthening fire weather seasons worldwide found that global mean fire weather season length increased by nearly 19% between 1979 and 2013, driven by global temperatures, rising by roughly 0.2 of a degree Celsius per decade over that same window. A trend, the study's authors note, is broadly consistent with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's own estimates of global land temperature increases. Later research, including work summarized by the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute, describes fire seasons in parts of the western United States extending by several months compared to historical norms, with projections suggesting the number of dangerous fire weather days will keep climbing in the decades ahead, even under aggressive emissions reduction scenarios. Separate research published this year in the journal Wildfire has also tied wildfire severity to soil health, finding that repeated high-severity burns are reshaping the microbial communities and forest soil across Colorado and Wyoming in ways that could affect how quickly burned land actually recovers. One more sign that what firefighters are increasingly up against is not the same fire their predecessors trained for a generation ago. It helps to put 2026 next to what came before it, because the history here did not start this year. Go back to 2013, and the danger of initial attack work is not new. It is the scale and frequency of it that appears to be shifting. In 2006, California alone recorded more than 8,200 wildfires that killed 7 firefighters and 2 civilians, according to state fire data. In 2022, California wildfires killed 9 people across the state, a season that also exposed serious cracks in staffing, with officials at the time warning that some regions could see firefighting capacity fall below 75% of what was needed. That same year, investigators later determined that the Dixie Fire, the largest non-complex wildfire in California's recorded history at the time, had been sparked by a tree contacting Pacific Gas and Electric's power lines. A reminder that even as climate conditions worsen, the ignition sources behind these fires remain a mix of lightning, human accident, and utility infrastructure failure. In 2023, California recorded 4 wildfire deaths, 3 of them firefighters, after a mid-air collision between 2 firefighting helicopters near Cabazon in Riverside County. A contract pilot, a Cal Fire Division chief, and a Cal Fire captain were killed, while the crew of the second aircraft landed safely. The National Transportation Safety Board opened an investigation into that crash, and in 2024, Montana alone recorded 1 firefighter death during its wildfire season, even as the state logged more than 1,200 individual fires. None of these were freak, isolated years. They are the backdrop against which the Knowles Fire burnover happened. A running total of firefighters killed almost every single year, in different states, under different conditions, doing fundamentally the same dangerous work. The Palisades fire itself is worth returning to briefly, because its cause turned out to be as unsettling as its scale. Investigators ultimately determined, and authorities later made an arrest in connection with the case, that the Palisades fire was caused by the rekindling of an earlier, arson-caused wildfire in the same area, meaning the fire that would go on to destroy more than 6,800 buildings and kill a dozen people did not start from lightning or downed power lines, but reignited from a blaze investigators believe had already been deliberately set. In the fire's early hours, Los Angeles County officials were still counting the human cost in real time. On January 12, 2025, county officials announced the combined death toll from the Palisades and Eaton fires had climbed to 16, with 5 deaths attributed to the Palisades fire and 11 to the Eaton fire at that point, and warned the number would likely keep rising as search teams and cadaver dogs worked through leveled neighborhoods. By January 13th, ABC News reported the toll had reached 24, with more than a dozen people still unaccounted for, as thousands of firefighters worked across 45 square miles of densely populated Los Angeles County. Then President Joe Biden received a briefing from Cal Fire officials at a Santa Monica fire station and pledged federal assistance, while officials noted the region had gone through its driest start to a winter in decades, a condition meteorologists directly linked to the explosive spread once the Santa Ana winds arrived. There's also a policy dimension to this that predates the current pay fight by years, and understanding it helps explain why 2026's staffing numbers, even when they hit their target on paper, still leave officials uneasy. Back in May 2022, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon and a bipartisan group of colleagues sent a formal letter to the Secretaries of Agriculture and the Interior and the Director of the Office of Personnel Management, warning that low pay had already hollowed out the federal wildland firefighting workforce to a breaking point. In that letter, the senators noted that fire officials had been unable to fill an unprecedented 1-800 interagency requests for wildland firefighting crews the previous year, along with more than 1,900 requests for fire engines, meaning that when local and state agencies asked the federal government for help, the help simply was not available, in many cases, because there weren't enough trained people to send. The senators called this an urgent threat to public safety and to taxpayer dollars, noting that when federal resources are unavailable, the government ends up paying a premium to contract and borrow firefighting resources from state and local authorities instead, a more expensive, less coordinated way of getting the same job done. More recently, in April 2026, the Office of Personnel Management proposed new hazard pay rules that would give federal wildland firefighters a 25% pay increase specifically for work on prescribed burns, the controlled preventative burns that reduce the fuel available for future wildfires. The National Federation of Federal Employees called it a goal the union had pursued for years through legal action, legislation, and regulatory pressure, and said it appeared finally within reach. Whether that rule is fully implemented in time to matter for the back half of the 2026 fire season is still an open question. It's also worth noting that hazard pay for prescribed burns addresses only one narrow slice of a much larger compensation problem. It does not, on its own, resolve the base pay gap that pushed so many firefighters toward the exits in the first place, nor does it address the housing costs that leave some wildland firefighters, according to reporting cited by NewsNation, sharing homes with multiple roommates just to make their salaries stretch through an entire fire season. Go back one more time to the fire outside Grand Junction, because that is really where this story lives. What happened to that rifle helitack crew on June 27th was not, according to everything confirmed so far, a case of recklessness or an obvious rule broken. It was, as best as investigators can currently describe it, a fast-moving fire, a lightning strike that sparked a second ignition nearby, and smoke that grew so thick, so fast, that even an aircraft standing by could not reach 5 people in time. Denver 7's coverage noted that the fire that ultimately killed 4 members of that crew had started small, the Knowles Fire, before merging with the Snyder and Jones fires into a single, much larger complex. The preliminary federal report is careful to describe itself as unfinished. Investigators wrote in their own language that the synopsis released so far represents only verified preliminary facts and does not represent final findings or conclusions, with further details to be shared once the complete investigation wraps up. That distinction matters, and it's worth being honest about it here rather than pretending the case is closed. We know how those 4 firefighters died. We do not yet have the federal government's final word on every decision, every radio call, and every contributing factor that led 5 people onto that ridge in the first place. Senator Hickenlooper's call for a swift and thorough investigation is, as of this recording, still working its way toward an answer. What we can say with more confidence is the pattern surrounding that single tragedy. Fire seasons across the American West and increasingly across the country are demonstrably longer than they used to be, according to multiple independent bodies of climate research spanning more than a decade of study. Fires are showing up outside the calendar window firefighters, communities, and emergency planners built their systems around. The Los Angeles fires of January 2025 being the clearest, costliest recent proof of that shift, arriving in what should have been the safest part of the year for Southern California. At the same time, the workforce asked to meet that longer, more unpredictable season has spent years absorbing pay that, until very recently, sat below minimum wage in some retail jobs. Staffing shortfalls that state and local officials openly admit they have not solved, federal workforce cuts layered on top of a system already stretched thin, and a documented rising burden of PTSD, depression, suicidal ideation, and long-term cancer risk that researchers themselves say remains understudied and, in some cases, simply undocumented. None of those pressures, on their own, caused what happened near Grand Junction in June. But together, they describe a profession where the fire is getting harder to predict. At the exact moment the system meant to fight, it is being asked to do more with people who are, by every available measure, more strained than they used to be. Before closing, it's worth being clear about where every figure in this account actually comes from, and where the record is still incomplete. The details of the Knowles Fire burnover, the timeline, the crew's assignment, the identities of Emily Barker, Nick Hutcherson, Sidney Watson, and Nathan Matthews, and the near-zero visibility finding come from the U.S. Department of the Interior's own statements, CNN's reporting, Denver 7's local coverage, and the Colorado Springs Gazette's reporting on the preliminary federal investigation report, which its authors explicitly describe as unfinished. The January 2025 Los Angeles fire details come from the Los Angeles Fire Department's own public statements, Fox Weather, CBS Los Angeles, and Britannica's documented casualty and damage figures, cross-checked against Wikipedia's sourced tracking of the incident. Wage and staffing figures trace back to ProPublica's investigation, Government Executive, Federal News Network, News Nation, and the U.S. Forest Service's own published workforce data. Mental health and cancer risk findings come from a peer-reviewed 2025 study in the International Journal of Wildland Fire, additional peer-reviewed research summarized by Psychiatric News, and reporting from Inside Climate News and Mountain Journal, both of which are transparent that hard, complete data on completed suicides among wildland firefighters specifically does not yet exist, a real limitation in what anyone, including this account, can claim with certainty. Broader fire season and climate trend data comes from a 2015 Nature Communications study, a 2026 Geophysical Research Letter study focused on North American wildfire seasonality, and statements from California's own state fire agency. Where any of these figures come from a single outlet, or where investigators themselves flag a finding as preliminary, that has been noted rather than smoothed over. So here's the honest, open question this leaves behind, because it doesn't have a tidy answer. If the climate science is right that fire seasons keep getting longer, and if the workforce data is right that staffing and mental health support haven't caught up to that longer season, what does the next 5 years of American wildfire response actually look like? And is there enough political will at the federal and state level to fix the pay, staffing, and mental health gaps before more crews end up in a burnover with nowhere left to go? What do you think should change first? The funding, the staffing model, or how this country plans for a fire season that increasingly doesn't end? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves out there.